As fishermen, we are just about the only dafties that'll do our sport regardless of the weather. Sunshine, beautiful, but if it's 45 miles an hour winds and it is piling rain down, we don't care, we're out fishing. Now, there are ways to catch more fish depending on the weather though, and the one we're going to go into today is lines. What sort of lines do you need to catch the most fish fly fishing, and when do certain lines work best? Let's chat about fly lines. First of all, quick conversation for any of the beginners on what a fly line is really quickly. The fly line, when I mention that, is the main line. So it is the line that has some sort of colour, some sort of material to it that isn't clear, just like that line in there. That is your main line. That is actually the weight that you use to cast your flies, to get your flies out onto the water. That is your main line, or your fly line. That's what we call it. So fly lines can do pretty much anything that you want them to do. You can have the traditional, the one that everyone starts off with and should start off with, and quite frankly, is probably the line that everyone catches the most fish on throughout the entire year, a full floating line. A full floating line is probably the most versatile fly line that you can get. And as a beginner, if you only were to have one line, I would say definitely it needs to be a floating line. Everyone knows what a floating line is, so I'm not going to go too deeply into why a floating line is so good in this video. Let's go into other types of lines. So first of all, from a floating line, I'd say the next most important line would be some sort of intermediate sinking line. Now, when I say intermediate sinking line, all I mean by that is that it sinks at an intermediate level. Now, that kind of means nothing. If you're brand new into fly fishing, what does intermediate mean? Well, it actually means about 1.5 inches a second is how quickly it sinks. That's based on what fly fishing companies traditionally use as the halfway marker for what's a slow sinking line, which is normally 1 inch per second, to a fast sinking line like this as a dive 7, and that means 7 inches a second that it dives at. So a DI7 is airflow's 7 inch per second sinking line. That's normally where there's those numbers that you'll hear thrown around. That's what they mean. How quickly does it sink? Now, an intermediate sinking line is so effective because you can get beneath the waves. If you're in a big wind, you can get beneath the level that you want your if you want to pull your flies back at a very straight level in under the water column, then you can get down to that depth that the fish are at and stay there. That's the important thing about it, is you're not necessarily just fishing it after you've let your flies drop down on a floating line or a midge tip. Sinking. Now, I'm just going to explain a little bit more about why I think it's so important to have some sort of sinking line in a big wave or in a wind. When you're fishing a floating line and you have a large ripple or a wave on the surface of the water, when your floating line is on top of that ripple, it creates bends in your line. So you're not in perfect contact with your flies at all times. If you can fish a slow intermediate or a sinking line that takes you below that wave, then you are in constant tension with your flies at all times. So regardless of whether you want to fish high in the water, you can fish a slow sinking line and try and fish super high in the water and be in better contact with your flies than a floating line. So even if you're fishing high in the water column, sometimes a sinking line can still do very well on that basis that you can fish it really high in the water column. So after that, we normally come on to the fact that fish's behaviour during certain weather patterns goes down in the water, and what's the best way to fish for them. Sometimes it is with a deep sinking line, especially in wintertime. You'll have seen some of my videos where I'm using a fast glass. That just simply means a fast intermediate, so it's on the faster end of the intermediate. I think a fast glass sinks at 2.5 inches a second. So that's one of my favourite lines by far for fishing. I mean, for fishing anything really. You can fish the washing line on it. You can fish pooling, which is my main go-to on a fast glass. You can even fish a team of nymphs on a fast glass. If you're wanting to fish them quite deep, then that's normally a really good way to do it, especially off of a boat. So sinking lines can be so versatile, and I would say if you're a beginner, invest in at least one sinking line, because it is a very, very handy tool to have, and quite frankly, they're really fun to fish with. So if you ever need a sinking line, head on over to My Fishing Flies. They've got plenty of sinking lines over there. And if you buy something before the middle of May, you'll be entered into a draw. If you use code VICEFLIES, you'll be entered into a draw for a box of flies that they're putting together worth £290. So go and check that out. Next, the classics. Midge tips and sink tips. Midge tips and sink tips are so important for fishing certain methods, especially from the boat. But to be honest, on bank fishing as well, they're just so good. So you get several types of sink tip. You get the lengths vary from 3 foot, 6 foot to 12 foot. All three are really good at their own different things. It just tends to be in how deep in the water column you want to fish. The other difference is whether it's a slow sinking tip or a fast sinking tip. Now, I prefer across the board slow sinking tips, and that's because I feel like you can kind of plumb the depth of the water a wee bit better. You don't necessarily just get straight down to quite a deep level or whichever level your sink tip is at. Now, sometimes that's important, and quite a lot of people actually prefer to fish a fast sinking tip line in a wind instead of the likes of what I prefer, which is like a slow intermediate. And that can be an extremely effective tool. But if you're fishing slow buzzers or nymphs, for example, or we've talked about the washing line a lot, if you're fishing a washing line, a 3 foot slow tip or a 6 foot slow tip, sometimes it's just amazing. It is one of those things that it just sits so perfectly in the water. A 6 foot slow tip with 2 dialbacks and a buzzer on the point. It is just and a fab on the point. Sorry, it's just fantastic way to fish. Now, I don't think that anyone would say that you need to have a midge tip as a beginner, but it's definitely a really useful tool to have. So if I was to go for my third must-have line, I would say a midge tip. 1 floater, 1 intermediate, 1 midge tip. Now, other than that, everything else is kind of preference and fill in the gaps. Some lines do amazingly well some days, but if you just need 3 lines and it's the only 3 lines you were going to have for the rest of your fly fishing career, those 3 lines would do you. You would catch fish in any weather, you'd catch fish in any scenario with these 3 lines. So go and have a look at what you fancy filling up the bag with, and let's have a chat in the comments below as to what your favourite line is. In fact, here's an interesting question. What do you think you've caught the most fish on? Which line do you think you've caught the most fish on? Now, Matt, I'm going to have to go with floater, just purely because we've fished a floater so much, but then I look at like how often throughout the year do we fish sinking lines? And I fish my fast glass so much. Is it my fast glass? I don't actually know. Let's have a chat in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next video.